Nancy Pelosi believed she could utterly dismantle Senator John Kennedy, leveraging her East Coast elitism. She'd mock his Southern accent, dismiss his intelligence, and brand him as backward. Little did she know, he was a Rhodes Scholar, an Oxford-educated lawyer, who had quietly been compiling a dossier of evidence against her for years. So, what unfolded next? With his signature Louisiana drawl and a disarming smile, Kennedy systematically laid bare her insider trading, her January 6th cover-up, the corruption surrounding her Taiwan trip, and a staggering $23 million in suspicious profits. That's what happens when you underestimate a country lawyer. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room, nestled in the Hart Senate office building, always had a different feel on Thursday mornings. It was something about the light streaming in through those tall windows, or perhaps the way sound resonated in the space, steeped in the weight of history within its walls. But today, the room was absolutely packed, beyond capacity. Every single seat in the gallery was taken, with people spilling out along the back wall. Media cameras were lined up 3 deep. Even reporters from major networks, who typically overlooked committee hearings, were present. This was far from normal Thursday business. Everyone in that room knew something significant was about to unfold. At the elevated semicircular dais, 15 senators occupied their assigned seats. Chairman Dick Durbin sat centrally, flanked by Democrats to his right and Republicans to his left, all keenly aware that the hearing they were about to preside over would make headlines. The topic at hand was Senator John Kennedy's proposed legislation. Dubbed the Congressional Ethics and Accountability Reform Act, it called for real-time disclosure of stock trades, term limits for leadership, and stricter penalties for insider trading. Common-sense reforms that everyone claimed to support, but few actually wanted to pass. Kennedy had introduced the bill just 6 months prior. It had gained surprisingly strong momentum. Public polling indicated an impressive 87% support. Even Democrats found it difficult to openly oppose the bill. So their strategy was to invite an expert witness to testify against it. Nancy Pelosi herself. She settled into the witness table with the self-assured confidence of someone who had testified before Congress hundreds of times before. Donning a navy blue pantsuit, a pearl necklace, and an American flag pin on her lapel. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed. Not a single strand was out of place. 5 individuals surrounded her at the table. 2 lawyers, in expensive suits that practically screamed K Street, were beside her. Her chief of staff hunched intently over a laptop. Her communications director scrolled through talking points on a tablet, and a policy advisor meticulously arranged briefing books into precise stacks. It was the very infrastructure of power on display. Pelosi had served as Speaker of the House twice and represented San Francisco for an impressive 37 years. She was undeniably one of the most powerful politicians in America. She had a history of destroying opponents, and she fully expected to destroy this particular bill and its sponsor today. Across the room, at the committee dais, Senator John Kennedy occupied his assigned seat. He was third from the left on the Republican side. He wore a simple gray suit, one that looked like it might have been purchased from a Baton Rouge department store. His blue tie slightly loosened, and reading glasses perched on his nose as he meticulously reviewed papers before him. He looked exactly like what he presented himself to be, a 68-year-old senator hailing from Louisiana. Someone who spoke slowly, often using words like ain't, and frequently shared anecdotes about his daddy's sage advice. What he decidedly did not look like was someone who had studied at Oxford University on a Rhodes Scholarship, or someone who had earned a law degree from the University of Virginia, practiced law for decades, and served as Louisiana's state treasurer before ultimately joining the Senate. People made that critical mistake constantly. They'd hear the accent, observe the folksy demeanor, and immediately assume simplicity. By the time they truly grasped their misjudgment, it was almost always too late. In the gallery, directly behind the witness table, an entire row had been claimed by proud Louisiana residents. These were Kennedy's constituents, individuals who had driven or even flown all the way to Washington solely to witness this hearing. They sported LSU shirts and Saints jerseys. One man proudly wore a hat that read, "Kinjun Navy." They knew exactly what was about to happen. They had seen Kennedy in action before, watched him during countless committee hearings, and observed him question witnesses with that deliberate Louisiana drawl, a cadence that artfully lulled people into dropping their guard just moments before he delivered his decisive blow. Adjacent to the Louisiana contingent sat small business owners, restaurant operators, and shop proprietors, people whose livelihoods had been systematically decimated while politicians seemingly grew richer. They had come to finally see someone held accountable. And in the very front row, positioned almost directly behind Pelosi, sat the families of January 6th defendants. Mothers, grandmothers, and sisters, people who had painfully watched their loved ones denied due process, denied access to crucial evidence, and held in pre-trial detention for months, even years, all for mere trespassing charges. They had come for one reason: to hear the truth. Chairman Durbin then called the hearing to order. The sound of his gavel echoed sharply through the chamber. All conversation instantly ceased. Cameras sharply focused, and recording lights blinked a steady red. Durbin's voice had that polished, neutral tone, the kind you hear from someone who'd spent decades in the Senate. He knew just how to sound fair, even when he was anything but. This Senate Judiciary Committee hearing will now come to order. Today, we're here to review Senator Kennedy's proposed Congressional Ethics and Accountability Reform Act. He paused, glancing at the cameras, ensuring his next statement would hit just right. This bill suggests big changes for how members of Congress handle their money and how long people can stay in leadership roles. These are serious issues that truly call for serious thought. He paused again. Then his eyes shifted to Kennedy. There was a flicker there, perhaps a warning or a challenge. We've asked Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi to share her expertise, drawing on her many decades in congressional leadership. Her insights will be crucial as we figure out if these reforms are truly needed, or if they might, as some believe, actually hurt good governance. How he said it made it clear exactly where Durbin stood. He turned to Pelosi, offering a warm smile. Speaker Pelosi, thank you for joining us today. The floor is all yours. Pelosi adjusted her microphone, then smiled for the cameras. She'd been through this thousands of times, knowing exactly how to seem both powerful and sensible at once. Thank you, Chairman Durbin. I truly appreciate this committee focusing on issues of congressional ethics. Ethics have always held deep importance for me during my 37 years representing the amazing city of San Francisco. Her voice was smooth, well-practiced, like someone who'd delivered enough speeches to fill a whole library, which is why this legislation we're talking about today bothers me. She opened a briefing book, making it look like she was checking notes she likely didn't even need. Senator Kennedy's bill claims it will fix issues like insider trading and too much power in leadership, but honestly, it's just political showmanship. It's all about grandstanding, designed to create cable news sound bites instead of real policy changes. That was the first jab, basically calling the bill unserious. She looked straight at Kennedy, making it personal right then. I've observed Senator Kennedy's performances during committee hearings for the past several years. You know, the folksy accent, the good old boy metaphors, that simple country lawyer act he pulls off so well for the cameras. Her tone made it abundantly clear she was mocking him, finding his whole act transparent and just plain tiresome. But this isn't a movie set, and this isn't a courtroom drama. We're tackling complicated governance issues that need deep understanding, not just easy answers sugar-coated with Southern charm. Gasps spread through the Louisiana section of the audience. She'd just openly insulted not only their senator, but their entire home state. Pelosi kept going, picking up speed. Now, Senator Kennedy actually represents one of the poorest states in our country. Louisiana is 49th in education, 47th in healthcare, and 46th in economic chances. Maybe the senator's time would be better used fixing his own state's problems instead of showing off about Washington ethics. That insult was clearly intentional and well-planned. She wanted Kennedy mad, on the defensive, hoping he'd react emotionally so she could prove he was just what she'd called him. All show, no real substance. This bill would essentially cripple congressional leadership by forcing arbitrary term limits. It would make people reveal their investment decisions too early, information that could easily be used as a political weapon. It really just shows a basic misunderstanding of how Congress works, how laws get made, and how groups come together. She leaned back a bit, getting ready for her grand finale. I respect Senator Kennedy's right to put forward bills, even ones that are badly thought out. But let's not pretend this is any kind of serious policy reform. It's just performance art. It's a Southern politician just playing to his base, a base that doesn't quite grasp how complicated modern governance really is. She folded her hands on the table, clearly pleased with her own show. She'd asserted her dominance, put Kennedy firmly in his place, and made it obvious he was way out of his depth. The media would definitely run with her sound bites. Things like performance art, poorly conceived, doesn't understand complexity. That's what would blow up on social media, what cable news would keep replaying. She had won before Kennedy even said a word. Or, at least, that's what she thought. The room held its breath, waiting for Kennedy to respond. Cameras zoomed in on his face, looking for anger, for him to get defensive, for any emotional reaction that would prove Pelosi's attack was right. But they didn't find it. Kennedy stayed completely still for 5 long seconds. His face gave absolutely nothing away. No anger, no hurt, not even a flicker of surprise. Just that little smile, his go-to expression, as if he always had some secret joke playing out in his head. The silence just stretched on and on. 5 seconds felt like 5 excruciating minutes in that packed hearing room with every eye glued to him. When Kennedy finally started talking, his words came out slowly. Each single syllable was drawn out, like taffy being pulled thin. His Louisiana accent seemed even thicker than usual somehow. "Well, Speaker Pelosi, I surely do appreciate you carving out time from your busy schedule to come visit with us here today." His voice was friendly, even respectful. No edge, no hint of sarcasm that anyone could later pinpoint. But something in that room had definitely shifted. The Louisiana folks up in the gallery leaned forward, intrigued. They recognized that tone, all right. They'd heard it before. It was always right before Kennedy completely dismantled some witness who thought they had him figured out. "Now, I gotta be straight with y'all about something." Kennedy paused, glanced down at his notes, then looked back up, that same smile still playing on his lips. "You're right about some things. I really am just a simple country lawyer from Louisiana. Can't argue with that." He slowly took off his reading glasses, polished them with his tie, taking his sweet time, making everyone wait. I got my undergraduate degree from Vanderbilt University. That's down in Tennessee. Then, somehow, I managed to get myself accepted at Oxford University, clear over in England. Magdalen College, if anyone's curious. They gave me what they call a Rhodes Scholarship. He said it all so casually, like it was absolutely no big deal. But everyone in that room knew exactly what a Rhodes Scholarship truly meant. It's one of the most prestigious academic honors anywhere in the entire world. Still not entirely sure how that even happened, but I ended up spending a couple of years over there studying philosophy, politics, and economics. Met some mighty sharp folks, too, and I learned a thing or two. His false modesty was just pitch perfect. He was self-deprecating, but never came across as weak. He was making light of accomplishments that would easily be the crowning glory of most folks' entire lives. Then I came back home and went to law school at the University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson School, and practiced law for a spell back in Louisiana. Nothing too fancy, just regular old legal work. Then I served as state treasurer for a bit before the good folks back home decided to send me up here. He put his glasses back on, then opened the thick folder sitting right in front of him. So, you're absolutely right, Speaker Pelosi. You truly are. I'm just not as sophisticated as you folks up there in San Francisco. I don't really understand all the complexities of how Washington actually works. Now, where I come from, people usually just say what they mean. They don't dress up simple ideas in fancy language just to make them sound more important than they truly are. His voice remained friendly, but a layer of steel had suddenly appeared beneath it, something sharp lurking just beneath that folksy exterior. Which, actually, brings me to why I asked Chairman Durbin if you might be willing to testify for us today. See, I've been digging into some financial transactions, some stock trades, and certain timing patterns that struck me as mighty interesting. He pulled the very first document from his folder, holding it up so all the cameras could clearly capture the header. An official House financial disclosure form. Now, I'm just a simple country lawyer, but even I can spot insider trading when it's staring me right in the face. The room went absolutely dead silent. Nobody was typing. Nobody was moving. Everyone was just watching, transfixed. Kennedy's smile never even wavered. Now, if you don't mind, I'd just like to ask you a few questions about your husband's stock trades, purely to educate myself, of course, you being so sophisticated and all. The Louisiana residents in the gallery exchanged knowing smiles. They knew this act perfectly, that simple country lawyer routine, right before the kill. Pelosi's confident expression faltered just a hair. Her lawyers leaned in closer, whispering urgently to her. She waved them away dismissively. She had faced hostile questioners plenty of times before. She believed she could handle this. She had no idea what Kennedy truly had hidden in that folder. No idea how many hours he'd poured into building that case, tracking those trades, meticulously documenting every pattern, all while preparing for this exact moment. Well, she was about to find out. Kennedy reached back into his folder, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and held it up at an angle so both the gallery and the cameras could see it was indeed an official document. Numbers and dates were clearly visible, even from a distance. Speaker Pelosi, your husband, Paul, he's quite the investor, isn't he? The question came out sounding friendly, almost conversational, as if they were just chatting about the weather or football scores. Now, I'm certainly no financial expert, barely even understand my own retirement account, truth be told, but I've been reviewing some of his trades from over the past few years, just out of simple curiosity. You understand? He looked down at the document, then back up at Pelosi and said, and that's when I noticed something peculiar. The word peculiar stretched out into three distinct syllables. His Louisiana drawl made it sound almost musical, actually. Back in December 2020, your husband purchased some call options on Tesla stock, 25 call options to be exact. Now, that's basically a bet that the stock price is going to climb. He shelled out around $1 million for those options. Kennedy paused, making sure everyone in the room was keeping up. Now, for anyone watching at home who might not quite get how options work, let me break it down simply. It's pretty much like snagging a lottery ticket, but if you guess wrong, instead of just losing your initial cash, you could lose everything, and fast. Definitely a high-risk, high-reward kind of deal. He glanced over at Pelosi once more, that smile still on his face. Just 2 weeks after your husband snapped up those Tesla options, President Biden dropped the news that the federal government would switch its whole vehicle fleet to electric cars. That's a massive 650,000 vehicles, the biggest electric vehicle purchase ever recorded. The silence stretched on. He let everyone connect the dots. Tesla's stock then shot up a whopping 43% within the following month. And just like that, your husband's options were suddenly worth roughly $2.6 million. So he sold them off, raking in about $1.6 million in profit from a trade that lasted just 2 weeks. Those numbers just hung heavy in the air. $1.6 million in a mere 2 weeks. Pelosi attempted to respond. Her voice came out sounding quite defensive. A stark contrast to the smooth confidence she'd shown in her opening statement. "My husband makes his own investment decisions," she stated. "I'm not involved in any of his trading activities. I don't discuss pending legislation with—" Kennedy gently raised his hand, not in an aggressive way, just signaling for a moment to wrap up his point. "Oh, I'm sure that's completely true," he responded. "I'm sure you and your husband never, ever talk about his investments. Y'all probably just chat about the grandkids and what's for dinner. You know, normal married couple stuff." That smile never once left his face. But here's what just strikes me as mighty coincidental. Your husband bought options in an electric vehicle company exactly 2 weeks before the biggest electric vehicle announcement in government history. An announcement that you, being the speaker and all, just had to know was on its way. He then pulled out another document from the folder. Let me give you yet another example. In March of 2021, your husband went and purchased 10,000 shares of Alphabet stock. That's Google's main parent company. He spent about $2.3 million on that. Kennedy lifted his gaze from the paper. At that exact moment, there was antitrust legislation making its way through the House. Legislation that would have absolutely broken up big tech companies, severely hurting their stock prices. Google itself was even testifying before your committees regarding it. Another brief pause followed. He was clearly building the timeline. Well, the bill never actually made it to a floor vote. It ended up dying right there in committee. Google's stock, naturally, went up. Your husband sold off his shares 3 months down the line, pulling in around $800,000. He put that document to the side and reached for yet another. Then, in July 2021, a Microsoft call options investment of $1.2 million, which yielded about $2 million when the stock soared after cloud computing contracts were approved. Contracts, mind you, that absolutely had to pass through appropriations, something you controlled as Speaker. Another document. September 2021, Disney stock. A $900,000 investment that turned into $1.3 million after the company received favorable treatment on streaming regulations. Then another one in January 2022, NVIDIA, a $3 million play in options. The stock shot up 31% right after semiconductor legislation went through. Your husband walked away with roughly $3.1 million on that one. Kennedy had now fallen into a smooth rhythm, presenting each trade calmly and methodically. His Louisiana draw never sped up, never showed a flicker of emotion, just a steady stream of facts, numbers, and dates. "Should I even keep going?" he asked. "I've got about 40 more of these, but I really don't want to bore folks." He cast his gaze toward Pelosi. Her face had now completely drained of color. The lawyers flanking her on both sides were furiously typing away. Her chief of staff had a phone glued to their ear. "Now, Speaker Pelosi, I took the time to add all this up, because even though I'm a simple man, I can certainly handle basic arithmetic." He then pulled out a summary sheet, with large numbers printed clearly enough for all the cameras to easily pick up. "Your husband has pulled in approximately $23 million from stock trades since January 2020. That's right around when you became Speaker for the second time. $23 million in just 3 short years." He let that astonishing number just hang there. $23 million. Every single one of these trades, without exception, happened right around the time of legislation or government decisions that directly impacted those very companies. He single one. Kennedy then leaned back in his chair, his movement appearing casual and relaxed. "Now, I suppose your husband could just be the absolute luckiest investor in the entire history of congressional spouses. Maybe he's got some sort of magical ability to predict precisely when the government will take actions that boost the companies he owns stock in." The sarcasm was gentle, almost apologetic in its delivery, yet completely unmistakable. "Or perhaps," he mused, "something else entirely is going on here." Senator Chuck Grassley then spoke up. The Iowa Republican, at 89 years old, had been serving in the Senate since well before Kennedy's birth. His voice carried the distinct weight of someone who had truly seen it all. "Senator Kennedy, are you implying that the Speaker's husband had access to non-public information regarding legislative actions?" Kennedy turned to Grassley, maintaining a respectful and deferential posture toward the senior senator. "Senator Grassley, I'm not suggesting anything at all," he replied. "I'm simply laying out the facts, dates, trades, outcomes, and profits. Let everyone draw their own conclusions." He then turned his attention back to Pelosi. "But let me tell you a story. There's a lady named Martha Stewart. You might have heard of her. She's famous for cooking shows and home decorating, that sort of thing. She made a fortune with domestic products. The storytelling had a pure Louisiana draw now. Each word stretched out, making it conversational. Back in 2001, Martha sold some stock in a company called Imclone. She had a friend who was the CEO. He told her the company was about to announce some bad news. She sold her stock before that announcement, avoiding a loss of about $45,000. Kennedy paused, took off his glasses, and cleaned them once more. The federal government prosecuted her for insider trading, put her on trial, found her guilty, and sent her to prison for 5 months. He put his glasses back on, looking directly at Pelosi. $45,000, 5 months in federal prison. Another pause. He let the contrast build. Your husband made $23 million on trades that were perfectly timed. Nobody from the Justice Department has even asked any questions. Nobody from the SEC has opened an investigation. Nobody from the Ethics Committee has held a hearing. The Louisiana residents in the gallery were nodding. The small business owners were leaning forward. Even some Democrats on the dais looked uncomfortable. Kennedy's voice remained friendly, but his words cut like a knife. "Speaker Pelosi, I'm just a simple country lawyer from Louisiana, one of those poor, backward states you mentioned, but that just don't seem right to me. In fact, It seems crooked as a dog's hind leg. Laughter rippled through the gallery. Even some of the media smiled. The metaphor was so perfectly Kennedy, so distinctly Southern, and so devastatingly accurate. Pelosi tried to respond. Her voice came out strangled, defensive. These trades were all disclosed according to the law. My husband is a private investor who— Oh yes, ma'am, they were disclosed. Kennedy interrupted gently. They were eventually disclosed, often late, sometimes months after the legal deadline, but technically disclosed. He pulled out another document. Let me tell you about one trade in particular. This one really caught my attention. In March 2022, your husband bought 5,000 shares of Visa stock, worth $1.1 million. Kennedy's voice slowed even more, ensuring everyone heard every single word. At that exact moment, and I mean the exact same week, there was legislation pending in the House. The Credit Card Competition Act would have broken up payment processing monopolies, which would have hurt Visa badly. He looked at the document, then at Pelosi. That bill never got a vote. You kept it bottled up in committee. You never let it reach the House floor. Visa stock went up 29%. Your husband sold his shares 4 months later, making about $320,000. Kennedy held up the financial disclosure form. Here's what's interesting. This Visa purchase was disclosed to the Ethics Committee, but it was disclosed 38 days late, well past the 45-day deadline. He had to file an amended disclosure. He set the form down carefully. Why disclose late, unless maybe you knew that when people saw the trade and its timing, it would look mighty suspicious? Pelosi's lawyer leaned forward, attempting to object. Mr. Chairman, this line of questioning is inappropriate. The Speaker has no obligation to— Chairman Durbin looked torn. He wanted to protect Pelosi, but the questions were legitimate. The evidence was public record. He couldn't shut this down without looking like he was covering up corruption. The witness may decline to answer if she wishes. Durbin's voice sounded tired. Kennedy smiled, friendly as ever. Oh, she don't have to answer. I'm just establishing facts for the record, helping folks understand why we might need ethics reform. He closed that section of his folder, then opened another tab. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to talk about something else, something that troubles me even more than the stock trades. Pelosi's face showed relief. She wanted to move away from the financial evidence. Anything would be better than sitting there while Kennedy documented her husband's suspicious trades. She had no idea what was coming next. Kennedy pulled out a thick stack of papers, photos attached with paper clips, and documents with classification markings. Let's talk about the January 6th committee. The relief on Pelosi's face vanished instantly. In the gallery, the family members of January 6th defendants sat up straighter. Finally, someone was going to ask these questions. Kennedy's voice stayed calm, but something had fundamentally changed. That folksy humor was still there, but deep down, something much harder, something angry, was simmering. You created that committee, appointed every single member, rejected the Republican nominees Minority Leader McCarthy wanted, even hired a television producer to stage the hearings, and ultimately, you controlled every aspect of that investigation. He wasn't really asking questions yet. He was just stating facts, carefully building his case. And you controlled exactly what evidence the American people saw, and, even more critically, what evidence they didn't see. Kennedy then pulled out the first photo, holding it up for everyone to see. It was security camera footage, with the timestamp clearly visible from January 6, 2021. There were actually 41,000 hours of security footage from January 6th alone. Capitol Police cameras recorded absolutely everything, every hallway, every entrance, every single room. He then gently set the photo down on the table right in front of him. The committee, of course, reviewed all that footage. It took months. Teams of staffers watched every single hour, but they only ever showed the American people about 90 minutes of carefully selected clips. Kennedy pulled out even more photos, spreading them across the table now. I just got really curious about what exactly wasn't being shown. So, my staff and I reviewed some of that footage ourselves. We spent weeks watching what your committee apparently decided the American people simply shouldn't see. He held up just one photo. It showed Capitol Police officers standing at a doorway. This particular shot was from the East Rotunda doors. It was 2:37 p.m. You can clearly see the timestamp right there. Capitol Police officers actually opened these doors from the inside, held them wide open, and then waved protesters right inside. Here was another photo, this one from a completely different angle. Look, here's another view. It's the same doors. Officers were gesturing for people to just enter, not fighting them, not pushing them back at all, but actively inviting them inside. Kennedy's voice now carried a definite edge. There was a controlled anger just beneath that folksy delivery. So why didn't the American people ever get to see this footage? Why did your committee only show clips depicting violence and chaos? Why would you hide evidence of clear police cooperation? He then pulled out even more photos. These particular photos showed people walking quite calmly through the Capitol. These protesters just walked right in through open doors, stayed perfectly between the velvet ropes, took selfies, and frankly, they looked just like tourists. Yet, your committee presented them as violent insurrectionists, but the footage clearly shows them walking around quite peacefully. Senator Tom Cotton then jumped right in. The Arkansas Republican had clearly been waiting for this exact moment. Senator Kennedy, are you saying the January 6th committee actually withheld exculpatory evidence? Yes, sir. That's exactly what I'm saying. Kennedy's voice had now completely lost all its folksy humor. He was dead serious. They had footage that absolutely would have helped those defendants. It clearly showed police letting people right in. It showed confused protesters who genuinely thought they were allowed to be there, but they simply didn't release it. He then pulled out a document, a legal filing, from one of those very cases. Now, let me tell you about a grandmother from Oklahoma. Her name is Pamela Hemphill. She was 72 years old when she simply walked into the Capitol through those wide-open doors. She stayed for about 20 minutes, left completely peacefully, and didn't vandalize a single thing. She didn't assault anybody, she just walked around. Kennedy's voice cracked ever so slightly then, emotion clearly breaking through. The FBI raided her home at 6 in the morning, arresting her right in front of her own grandchildren. She spent 14 months in pre-trial detention, in solitary confinement, all for trespassing. This woman was 72 years old. He held up that legal document. Your committee actually had footage showing police opening those doors. That evidence would have clearly proven she didn't break in. She didn't force entry, but they didn't release it until after. She pleaded guilty until after she'd already spent more than a year in solitary confinement. In the gallery, an elderly woman was openly crying. She was the grandmother of a January 6th defendant, finally hearing someone tell her grandson's true story. Kennedy, however, wasn't done yet. You know, what do we call it when prosecutors have evidence that clearly helps the defense, but they just don't provide it? We call that a Brady violation. It's completely illegal. It gets cases overturned all the time. It gets people disbarred. He looked directly at Pelosi, that friendly smile now completely gone from his face. But your committee, you see, wasn't bound by normal rules of due process. You weren't prosecutors at all. You were politicians, so you simply withheld whatever evidence didn't fit your narrative. Pelosi tried to respond, her voice notably tight. The committee, she claimed, showed representative footage of what happened that day. Representative, Kennedy interrupted. Or perhaps selective. There's a big difference there. He then pulled out yet another set of photos. Here's Jacob Chanley, the so-called QAnon shaman, the guy with the horns and the face paint. Your committee presented him as this violent insurrectionist, showing clips of him yelling and acting absolutely crazy. Kennedy spread those new photos across the table. This footage, however, shows Capitol Police officers walking him through the building, actually escorting him, even opening doors for him. They take him all the way to the Senate chamber, and then they help him get right to the dais. There were 9 officers with him, not restraining him, not arresting him at all, but rather escorting him as if they were giving him a tour. The photos, truly, were undeniable. There were clear images of police guiding Chanley through the Capitol building. Why didn't the American people see this? Why did your committee hide evidence that actually undermined their own narrative? Kennedy leaned forward, his voice hard. I'll tell you why. Because you weren't truly interested in the truth. You were interested in a political weapon instead. You wanted to destroy Donald Trump and anyone associated with him, and you were willing to deny people their due process to make it happen. Senator Grassley spoke again. His voice carried clear disappointment. Speaker Pelosi, did you personally review all that footage before deciding what to release publicly? Pelosi looked utterly cornered. Her lawyers were both talking at once, clearly trying to figure out how to respond. The committee made collective decisions about, "That's not what I asked." Grassley's voice was sharp. Did you personally review the footage showing police cooperation with protesters before deciding to actually withhold it? Silence. Pelosi just stared down at her notes. Kennedy gave her a moment, then he continued. I've got one more question about January 6th. Just one more. He pulled out a final photograph. It showed a man with a baseball cap telling people to go into the Capitol. Who is Ray Epps? Pelosi looked genuinely confused. She clearly didn't know where this was going. Ray Epps was filmed on January 5th, telling people they needed to go into the Capitol. He was filmed again on January 6th, directing people toward the building, urging them to go inside. He's on video dozens of times, in fact. Kennedy held up the photo so the cameras could see it clearly, but Ray Epps was never arrested, never charged, and never faced any consequences. Your committee actually defended him when people started asking questions. They called it a conspiracy theory. He then set the photo down. Why, out of all the people caught on camera that day, was the one person clearly encouraging others to enter the Capitol? He was the only one who never faced charges. There was no response from Pelosi. She couldn't answer without admitting things she clearly didn't want to admit. Kennedy let the silence stretch for a moment. Then he closed that folder. I think the American people can draw their own conclusions about that. He reached for a different folder now, one that was thinner than the others, but somehow it felt much heavier. Now, if we're done with January 6th, I'd like to talk about your trip to Taiwan. Pelosi's face went from pale to ghostly white. This was the evidence she apparently didn't know he had. Kennedy opened the new folder slowly, deliberately, making everyone in the room wait. It was August of 2022 when you took a trip to Taiwan. It was highly publicized, controversial, and created an international crisis with China. He pulled out the very first document, a timeline printed in large font. Let me walk you through exactly what happened. July 28, 2022, President Biden signed the CHIPS and Science Act. It was the biggest investment in semiconductor manufacturing in American history. That was $52 billion in subsidies for companies that make computer chips. Kennedy looked up from the document, making sure everyone was following along. Now, certain companies were going to benefit tremendously from this bill, of course. Companies like Intel, NVIDIA, Micron, and the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, all of them positioned to get billions in government money. He then pulled out another document. It was Stock Transaction Records, August 1st, 2022. Just one day after the CHIPS Act signing, your husband Paul purchased 20,000 shares of NVIDIA, 10,000 shares of Micron, and 15,000 Taiwan Semiconductor ADRs. Kennedy paused. He let people process the numbers. That was a total investment of $4.1 million in semiconductor companies. One day after the biggest semiconductor bill in history passed, the timing, he argued, was simply too perfect to be a coincidence. Then, on August 2nd, you announced you were flying to Taiwan, which surprised everybody. China immediately threatened military action. Our own State Department warned against it, but still, you insisted. He held up another document, Flight Records. August 3rd, you flew to Taiwan. You met with semiconductor company executives. You toured Taiwan semiconductor facilities, and you discussed CHIPS Act implementation. Kennedy looked directly at Pelosi. Your husband had just invested $4 million in semiconductor stocks, and you flew to meet with those very same semiconductor executives to discuss how they'd get government subsidies. He let that sink in. The connection was undeniable. Now, some folks might call that a conflict of interest, but I'm just a simple country lawyer myself. What do I know? Senator Cotton interrupted at that point. He'd clearly been waiting to pile on. Senator Kennedy, what exactly happened to the stock prices after Speaker Pelosi's trip? Kennedy then pulled out price charts and graphs showing the stock movements. By December 2022, just 4 months later, NVIDIA was up 31%, Micron was up 24%, Taiwan Semiconductor was up 19%. He did the math slowly, making sure everyone in the room could follow. He pulled out one last document, printed in big, bold letters. The language was simple. Speaker Pelosi, he began, my bill requires members of Congress and their spouses to report stock trades within 24 hours. It forbids them from trading in companies that come before their committees. And it caps leadership roles at 8 years. He looked right at her. Will you support it? Silence filled the room. Pelosi just stared at the table. Her lawyers were whispering frantically, but she had no good answer, no matter which way she went. If she supported it, she'd be admitting the need for change. If she opposed it, she'd be proving Kennedy right about the corruption. She was completely trapped. Kennedy just waited. 5 seconds passed, then 10, then 15. Finally, his voice returned, full of that familiar Southern charm. I'll just take that as a no, he said. He closed his folders, stacked them neatly, and then looked at Pelosi with his famous Louisiana smile. But that's perfectly fine. We actually don't need your support. We've got the American people on our side. They know corruption when they see it, even when it's dressed up in fancy words and expensive pantsuits. He paused. The final blow was coming. Bless your heart, he drawled. For anyone not from the South, that phrase might sound polite, even sweet, but everyone below the Mason-Dixon line knew exactly what he meant. It was the Southern way of calling someone an idiot, of dismissing them with a hint of pity. The ultimate insult, disguised as kindness. The Louisiana contingent in the gallery burst into laughter. They'd been waiting for it. They knew it. It was the quintessential Kennedy moment. Even a few senators couldn't help but crack a smile. Pelosi's face turned bright red. She knew she'd been insulted. She knew Kennedy had just humiliated her on live television, but she couldn't reply without seeming petty. She gathered her papers, her team closing ranks around her, a protective shield for their wounded leader. "Mira, Chairman," she sputtered, "I don't need to sit here and be insulted by someone who doesn't understand how Washington works." Her voice was trembling. Anger and deep humiliation were swirling together. This hearing is nothing but a sham. Pure political theater. Exactly what I warned everyone about. Chairman Durbin tried to intervene. "Perhaps we should take a short recess." "No need," Pelosi declared. She stood up. "I've said everything I came here to say. I'm not going to waste any more time on this charade." She headed for the exit. Her entire group followed right behind her. Lawyers and staff formed a protective bubble around her. As she walked through the gallery, no one stood up. Tradition dictated that you rose when a witness left, as a sign of respect. But the Louisiana residents stayed seated. The small business owners didn't stir. The January 6th families remained in their chairs, a silent, powerful judgment. One of the grandmothers spoke softly as Pelosi passed, her voice barely a whisper, yet everyone in the silent room heard it. "My grandson is still in prison." Pelosi heard it. Everyone saw her flinch, but she kept walking, pushing through the door and into the hallway. Away from the cameras, the questions, and the stark evidence of her corruption. Behind her, Kennedy sat calmly at the desk. His papers were organized. His job was done. The Louisiana residents were clapping now. Not a loud, showy applause, but a steady, rhythmic one. Their senator had stood up for them, for their state, and for ordinary Americans against the corruption in Washington, all with a smile, a drawl, and some truly devastating evidence, exactly as they'd always known he would. The hearing continued for another hour after Pelosi left, but it felt anticlimactic. She had been the main event. Kennedy had been the prosecutor, and the case had been made. 2 weeks later, Kennedy's Congressional Ethics and Accountability Reform Act came up for a vote in the Senate. It included real-time stock disclosure requirements, term limits for leadership positions, and tougher penalties for insider trading. It passed with an impressive 81-19 vote. Even Democrats, who had privately opposed it, couldn't vote against it publicly. Not after Kennedy's hearing. Not after all the evidence he'd laid out. And certainly not after Pelosi's humiliation had been broadcast live to the world. The bill then moved to the House, where it also passed, by a vote of 43-32. The president signed it into law just 3 weeks later. The media coverage was absolutely extraordinary. Conservative news outlets hailed it as Kennedy's finest hour. "Simple country lawyer destroys Pelosi" became the headline across a dozen websites. Even mainstream media outlets had to acknowledge what had happened. They tried to downplay it, tried to defend Pelosi, but the evidence was simply too clear, the numbers too precise, and the timing too perfect. Clips from the hearing racked up 120 million views in the first 48 hours. Kennedy's "Bless Your Heart" moment instantly became a classic. It was shared across every social media platform, turning into memes, GIFs, and even ringtones. Conservative America felt a sense of satisfaction. Finally, someone had held Pelosi accountable. Finally, the corruption had been brought to light. Finally, a politician had faced real consequences. Pelosi held a press conference 2 days after the hearing. She tried to claim she was vindicated. She insisted Kennedy's questions were politically motivated. She maintained that her husband's stock trades were perfectly legal. But nobody believed her. The damage was already done. The evidence was out there for everyone to see. There was $23 million worth of suspicious trades, and on January 6th, evidence was held back. Then there was that Taiwan trip, happening right when her husband bought semiconductor stock. The pattern emerging was something you just couldn't deny. Just 2 months later, Pelosi announced she wouldn't be seeking a leadership position in the next Congress. She said she wanted to focus on her district, spend time with family, the usual polite excuses for being pushed out. The Pelosi era had come to an end. It wasn't with dignity or gratitude, but with clear, documented evidence of corruption, brought to light by a seemingly simple country lawyer from Louisiana. The Department of Justice actually launched an investigation into Paul Pelosi's stock trades just 3 weeks after Kennedy's hearing. The SEC then started their own investigation right behind them. Both investigations were still active. Nancy Pelosi's legacy wasn't really about her political accomplishments anymore. Instead, it was all about the corruption that Kennedy had brought to light. It was about the $23 million, the denied due process, the Taiwan trip, the undeniable truth that power corrupts, and the Rhodes Scholar who played the role of a country lawyer so convincingly that people forgot he was truly one of the sharpest minds in Washington. 3 months after that hearing, a reporter caught up with Kennedy in a Senate hallway and asked if he'd done a lot of preparation for his questioning of Pelosi. Kennedy flashed that famous Louisiana smile of his. "I just read the documents, followed the evidence, and asked common-sense questions. That's simply what lawyers do."
He paused, then adjusted his reading glasses. "Even simple country lawyers." The reporter pushed further, wanting to know if he'd been surprised by how effective his questioning turned out to be. "Surprised?" Kennedy let out a chuckle. "No, ma'am, I can't really say I was surprised." He started walking towards the Senate chamber then. The reporter followed close behind. "See, here's the thing Washington folks always seem to forget. The American people aren't stupid. They can spot hypocrisy from a mile away. They can clearly see corruption." He cleared his. "They know when powerful people are operating by a completely different set of rules." He stopped dead in his tracks and turned to face the camera.
Speaker Pelosi thought she could just brush me off because I talk slow and happen to be from Louisiana. She thought sophistication would somehow win out over common sense. She thought her power would simply shield her from any accountability. His smile widened even further. Well, she was wrong. The reporter then asked one final question. What did he have to say to critics who insisted his hearing was nothing but political theater? Kennedy's answer quickly became famous. It was quoted in newspapers all over the country. "My daddy always used to tell me something. He'd say, 'Son, you can put all the lipstick in the world on a pig, but at the end of the day, it's still a pig.' It doesn't matter how fancy your words might be. It doesn't matter how incredibly sophisticated your explanations sound. $23 million in insider trading is still, without a doubt, insider trading." He adjusted his tie, that very same rumpled department store tie he'd worn to the hearing. "I'm just a simple country lawyer from Louisiana, you know, one of those poor, backward states Speaker Pelosi had mentioned. But I absolutely know right from wrong. I know corruption the moment I see it." A final pause, a final smile. And so do the American people. He then walked straight into the Senate chamber. Back to work, just like that. Just another day in Washington for the Rhodes Scholar who had so perfectly played the role of a country lawyer. The reporter quickly filed her story. It ran that very evening on the news, and it got picked up nationally. The headline practically wrote itself. "Simple country lawyer exposes Washington corruption." Back in Louisiana, people just smiled. They had known it all along. Never, ever underestimate someone with a Southern accent and a law degree, especially when they're from Oxford, and especially when they've been quietly building a case. Because by the time you finally realize he's not simple at all, that trap has already sprung shut, and there's simply no escaping the evidence, no matter how sophisticated you might think you are.